Hello, welcome to my September wrap-up. Before I get into the books I read in the month of September, I'm first going to give some channel updates and news. The first being that I launched a new discussion series here on my channel, and it's called Why Read? I had episode 1 with Alan from the Library of Alexandria. I often credit Alan as the one who influenced me to start my channel in the first place, so it was very appropriate to have him in episode 1. And we had a fantastic time. He made me laugh so hard. And the whole idea behind this series, we did talk about it at the beginning of that discussion, but it's because I feel like on BookTube, I love watching advice videos and videos about how to read more or fall in love with reading and that kind of thing. And so I just love the question, why read? Because I think that goes back to our relationship with reading in the first place. Why do you choose to pick up a book rather than anything else? That's the idea there, but of course that'll be a point to start talking about some other things too, because I do have some ideas for other discussions, and I do have the first few episodes already lined up. So the next episode will be on October 15th. That'll be on Saturday at 7:30 p.m. EST with the Page Chewing crew. That's Steve Talks Books, Taylor from Made Between Pages, and P.L. Stewart, author of A Drowned Kingdom, because I know a lot of other people are doing discussion series on their channel, and I'm not trying to hog the spotlight. I want to try to highlight what other people are doing too, and I love what Page Chewing is doing, so want to bring attention to them. And Steve has been so gracious in inviting me to his channel on many occasions, and I need to have him on my channel, so I'm very excited for that discussion. I hope you'll join us. Then the next episode after that will be with none other than Dr. Fantasy and Professor Fireballs, and that will be about whether we as readers oversimplify what authors do. It's going to be fun, but it'll always start, these discussions will always start with the why read question, because I think it's a dynamic question that can vary depending on the person and time in life and that kind of thing. But I'm very excited, and I hope you'll join us for those episodes, and there will be more to come. And speaking of discussion series, by the way, I should mention, I will be on Matt on Books channel this Saturday at 12 p.m. EST with Jordan from Jordan Reads and Tori. And I'm so excited to talk with those three. I'm a huge admirer. I was actually friends with Matt right before he started his channel, and I already love all of his content so far. So it'll be a lot of fun to have that discussion. So please check that out. Please subscribe to Matt and Tori and Jordan. Very excited to chat with those three again. And aside from that, I was featured on 2 fantastic videos this last month on other people's channels. So I was on Fit to Be Read's top 210 sci-fi books. I am still making my way through that 3-hour and 38-minute video, and it's so good. There are so many other booktubers, but also authors, and there are cartoons and songs, and there's even a kind of cartoon joke with my name, with my introduction, which is so fun. But I was in that twice, and it's just such an honor to be on anybody's channel, especially Michael's channel too, because I've been such a huge admirer of his for a long time. He has added so many sci-fi books to my TBR, which I never get to, unfortunately, because I read so much fantasy, but I do want to. And there were so many books that I'm excited to look into after watching however much time I've already watched in that video. I'm still making my way through it, but it's so good. And the other video I was so honored to be a part of was Matt from Matt's Book Reviews. So different Matt than Matt on Books, but Matt's Book Reviews, favorite booktubers, favorite fantasy book of all time. And wow, what an honor to be part of that. And I've been following Matt's channel for a while, and his channel's just recently exploded. He's over 3,000 subscribers right now and just growing strong every day. But he and I share the same favorite fantasy book, which is pretty cool. And it's also interesting because I've never even shared that here on my channel, though you might be able to guess what it is. Anyway, it was such an honor to be a guest on both those channels. I'm always honored by that, and again, I hope to have many more people on my channel with the Why Read discussion. So that was really fun. Now on to books read, and I'm going to start with the second half of the month first, and then I'll work my way backwards because I did have a mid-month update. So I don't want to talk about those books at length that I already talked about in the mid-month update. And then I'm going to talk about 2 nonfiction books at the end, because I just don't think there's probably going to be a lot of interest in that here on this channel, but you let me know your thoughts on that. and I'll talk about my favorite book of the month too. So starting off with the end of the month. In September, I started, but actually didn't finish, so I can't really talk about this at length here. I'm not going to anyway. Sons of Darkness by Gaurav Mohanty. And so I finished this actually at the beginning of October, so I'm going to save my thoughts because I do want to do a spoiler-free book review on that book, and I am going to have a discussion with Angie, the Bookaholic, Anita Gada, and with Philip Chase. So I'm very excited about that, and that'll probably happen either very late this month or early next, and that'll happen here on my channel. So that did take up, like I said, most of the month, and then aside from that, I finished The Warlord Chronicles by Bernard Cornwell. I have a spoiler-free review of that. So I read Excalibur through audiobook and through ebook in the month of September. That trilogy, I've been saying, if you count Lord of the Rings as a standalone rather than as a trilogy, Warlord Chronicles is now my favorite trilogy of all time. I loved it. It was so good. It gave me so many emotions. It made me cry. It made me laugh. It made me cheer. It made me mad. It just brought in so many emotions, and I loved it. I just talked at length about it in a review, but one thing I'll say here that I'll repeat is that you do have to go into that trilogy a bit patient with book one, with all the names and locations thrown at you. Those of you who love to DNF books, you just have to remember that. It is very rewarding though if you stick with that journey. I thought it was just absolutely incredible. If you like Arthurian retellings, definitely check that one out and watch the review if you want to hear more. I also listened to the audiobook The Legend of Black Jack by A.R. Witham, narrated by the author, kindly gifted to me from the author, the audiobook anyway. I do have the ebook of this as well. So here's the thing. I had the wrong expectations going into this book. I knew it was going to be a portal fantasy and a YA book. I didn't quite expect it to read quite as young as it did. And the other thing about it is that people were talking about it being very nostalgic and kind of being reminiscent of Narnia and The Never-Ending Story. The Never-Ending Story by Michael Ende is actually probably my favorite middle grade portal fantasy, but this one just felt a little bit more action heavy and fast paced than I was anticipating. So I think when I think of those classics like Never-Ending Story and Narnia, I think of something that's a little bit more slow paced and that, I don't know, that just has a different kind of tone to it. He describes action scenes like no other though, and A.R. Witham is a wordsmith. He is so good at writing these very descriptive action scenes, so you're thrown and torn and splashed and every which way things are happening, and it's just relentless in its pacing. And maybe I just like more boring books because I just felt like I wanted things to breathe a little bit more, but it was very well written. The character of Jack is also very layered in the sense that he is a young boy. He's dealing with some heavy things such as guilt and with grief and with imposter syndrome, I would say. And at the same time, he has a strong sense of integrity and he knows how to stand up for himself when the moment calls. And he does so in a way that I thought felt very authentic to the character, and I think that's hard to do. So the writing is very good. I can understand why it's so popular. It just felt more modern and again, very much more action heavy than I was expecting. And I think it just read a bit younger than I was expecting too. So for those reasons, it just didn't quite click for me, but I do recommend it if you want a fast-paced, action-packed, middle-grade portal fantasy, then that is the one you should pick up. Next, I guess now I'm going into books I read in the first half of the month. And so I did talk in my mid-month update about Fairy Tale by Stephen King. I actually ended up going into a review of that book, and I didn't expect to do that. It just kind of happened. And so my thoughts about that are pretty much the same. I'm glad I read it. I enjoyed especially the beginning, and I liked how it ended, but yeah, it was very strange to have a very similar experience as most people in this corner of BookTube about the portal fantasy part. And then I also read and reviewed Babel by R.F. Kuang. And so I don't know that I need to go in depth about that here. I probably don't need to, but my feelings about this are the same in that I really enjoyed the project of the book. I enjoyed that This does deal with some really interesting themes regarding translation and colonialism, imperialism, colonization, colorism, sexism, even. So many themes. However, I felt like the story elements of the book fell a bit flat for me, so I give my reasons why in my spoiler-free review, and for that reason, it didn't really stay with me as much as I had hoped, but still glad I read it overall. So again, you want to hear my thoughts, you could watch that spoiler-free review. And then aside from that, I think, oh yes, I read Michael Moorcock's Elric Saga Book 1, Elric of Melniboné. This was a reread for me. The first 3 books in this bind-up are rereads for me, and I loved it. I didn't remember anything, well, very little. I remembered very little. It's just interesting to have a tragic main character who is sustaining himself with these drugs, and he's got a wild streak, and I really like the dark atmosphere, the twist on the magical sword trope that's in here, and I just had a good time. I had a good time with Elric of Melniboné. So I'm excited to talk about this with Sarah from Sarah Reads, and Evie from She Was Only Evie, Andrew from Andrew's Wizardly Reads, and Liam from Liam's Lyceum is joining us. He did a fantastic video earlier this year on sword and sorcery. After I requested that he do a video on sword and sorcery, he answered my request, and it was so good. He explains what sword and sorcery is, and he actually did a great video on Epic Pooh, which I also read before reading this. So he's kind of like an expert on on the subject in a way. And he also knows a lot about languages, and he actually read Babel after watching my review, which I thought that was kind of funny because I was kind of critical in my review, but he read it and he has his own review out for that. So definitely check out Liam's Lyceum because he's fantastic. Now to talk about the 2 nonfiction books I listened to, one being Radical Acceptance by Tara Brach. So this incorporates the practice of radical acceptance, which is a practice in which you learn to be present with whatever difficulty or challenge is coming up in your life and bringing a sense of compassion to it, of gentleness to it. And when you do so, you open up the capacity to be compassionate towards other aspects of yourself or other people. And this is also related to the practices of Buddhism, but she also makes it practical in a way that you can get benefit out of the book even if you're not a Buddhist. In fact, she's a psychologist and a practicing therapist, and some of her clients in the case studies in the book are not Buddhist. But I think it's very practical, and it's nothing I didn't already know, honestly. That's not why I picked up the book. I already knew everything she shared. Even the Buddhist things were not new things to me. But at the same time, I think that I needed to hear some of these messages again, because while I know all this stuff and I feel like I could have written the same book like 10 years ago, I don't feel like I'm a master at it by any means. And at this time of year, when it's fall and the seasons are changing, I always kind of encounter a small sense of melancholy. Even this year has been kind of weird because I've actually been more open to the fall than usual and kind of finding more beauty in it than I usually do. But yeah, I still feel like this calling to go within and to do some self-reflection. And so that goes into my last book I'm going to talk about, which is Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet. This was my favorite book of the month, possibly my favorite book of the year. I loved this book, regardless of whether it's a favorite book of the year or not. It's a favorite, I'll say that. And I have a whole story behind this book, which is that a little over 10 years ago, I was in a relationship. This was before I met my husband. I was in a serious long-distance relationship. And at the time, I considered my then boyfriend to have kind of like the heart of a poet, so to speak. And I bought this book for him as a gift because I heard so much praise for it, and something about it made me think he would love it. So I picked it up at a bookstore. He was also very into books at the time. I'm sure he still is, and I went to go visit him in Austin where he was living. I forgot the book. And then I came home, and not long after I returned, we broke up. So I never gave him the book. And so I had this copy and I thought, well, I may as well read it. So I did pick it up, and for whatever reason, I don't know if it was a timing thing or if it was a translation thing, but I just hit a wall with it. I could not get into this book, and I don't know what it was. I could tell there were beautiful things being said, but I just felt like, I don't know how to explain it. I just hit a wall. So I stopped reading it. It was on my nightstand for years, in the drawer of my nightstand for years. And then this last month, I was preparing answers for the "Why haven't you read this book yet?" tag. And there's a question in that tag about the book you've owned the longest that you haven't read yet. This was my answer. But I thought about it and I was too embarrassed because it's so small. It's such a short book. I thought, man, most people could probably read this in 20 minutes. It's ridiculous. Why haven't I read this yet? So I decided to read it so I wouldn't even have to mention it in the tag. And so I did, except I went on Scribd and I decided to check out if there was a different translation to see if it was a translation issue for me. And I found another version and I started listening to it. And the next thing I knew, I was in a trance. I loved it. I just hung on to every word and every pause. Maybe it was the narrator, maybe it was the translation. I don't know what it was, but it felt like it spoke to my soul. I know that sounds so dramatic, but I haven't had an experience like that with the book maybe ever because I just couldn't stop the tears from rolling. I cried. And it wasn't even that it was sad. It's just touching. These are letters. I'll put up the description on the screen so you can see what it's about, but it's just something about the way Rilke writes that really feels like it gets me. And the thing is, after I finished the audiobook, I did pick up this physical copy and I appreciated it a lot more, but it still wasn't the same as that other edition. I did go ahead and order a hard copy of the other edition so I could just compare some more. But these words will just live in me forever. I just loved it. And maybe it was a timing thing, who knows? It hit me in such a personal way. And I know it's hit a lot of people in a personal way, but it's very much about reaching into yourself to find your art or to connect with your art rather than the external world and learning to live with questions. So I just loved it. It's hard for me to talk about it because it's the way he explains things. It's the quotes he uses. I think even if you look up quotes for this book, you'll understand. It's just beautiful. So this is my book of the month, my favorite book of the month, Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet. And that's about it. So one more thing is the Warlord Chronicles discussion that got postponed. I know I said it was going to be that night in the video I gave for my review. And so I will let you know details when I find out what those are. We talked about another date. I don't know if it's been confirmed yet, so I'll let you all know. And thank you so much for watching. Let me know how your September went. Let me know your favorite book of the month. If you've read any of the books I mentioned, if you plan to read any of them, I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.